Hi guys, welcome to my library, or at least my library in the virtual world. Yes, that is my library behind me. Um, Welcome to the second of these lectures. I'm trying a different format. We'll see how this one goes and see if it gets a little better as we go. I'm hoping so. This topic is going to be about the 1,000-year argument. The 1,000-year argument is the result of Augustine's political theory that we talked about last time. Augustine does not intend to start wars between kings and popes. Really, there's not as much of a pope in his own day, so it's certainly not a factor in his thinking, but that's really what's going to happen. Both popes and kings are going to use Augustine to support their own claims of divine authority in the medieval world. And that kind of an argument between who's really the representative of God on earth stretches all the way out to the Reformation and really until you get the establishment of state churches in France, in Austria, and in the Germanic principalities, as well as in England. And you can actually kind of see the Reformation as the last great battle between kings and popes, but we'll get there further. But first, we need to kind of look at the counterpart to the authority of the Pope that we looked at last lecture. There we go. So let's look a little bit at the authority of the king. Our first real theorist on the authority of the king is going to be Hincmar of Reims, and he's kind of an unlikely figure. Hincmar of Reims is an archbishop, and he's an archbishop in the 9th century, which is also plagued by lots of Viking invasions, and as a result, we don't have any images of him other than what you see here, which is a stained glass representation. Now, Hincmar was the Archbishop of Reims during the latter Carolingian period, meaning under Charlemagne's descendants. He's actually born in the last years of Charlemagne's reign, and Charlemagne reigns until 814. And in his works, he is actually going to talk about the justification for why the Carolingian kings can keep the throne. Because unlike Charlemagne, who claimed it by right of conquest, they didn't do that. So where's their authority stem from? And he's going to begin by talking about the various options for becoming king. And he's pulling this straight from the Old Testament in many ways. Now, what he's going to do here is he's going to say there are three methods. And the first method is God's direct revelation. Now, God's direct revelation does not have anything to do with David, which is our first thought, is usually Samuel anointing David, and that's God's direct revelation. But no, this one actually pertains to two men in the Bible that we don't usually call king. One is Abraham, and the other is Moses. Moses is called directly by God, and Moses is a lawgiver, and kings give law. And he leads the people, he judges the people, he makes laws. All of those things are very, very kingly. But it's also going to apply to Abraham. Abraham is called directly by God, and in fact, he has the ability, with a snap of his fingers, to actually call 300 men up and stop a battle between the 4 kings and the 5 kings. Abraham has certainly the authority of a sheik. The second is God's direct revelation again, but this time I'm through the hand of men. And this is actually talking about the anointing of Saul and the anointing of David. God's anointed, which is going to be a very important concept as we go forward. The third one is where it gets complicated, but where Hincmar argues is where most kings in Europe really reside, within this kind of 3-pronged representation of God's blessing that he sees in the coronation of Solomon. Now, Solomon becomes king in 1 Kings, and we see that in the 2nd and 3rd chapters where he's taking ownership. But Psalm 72 actually records his coronation, and it's called the Coronation Psalm. Within that, we see 3 pieces necessary for the representation of God's divine blessing through the coronation. The first of these is, and you can see coronation of Solomon is all over medieval iconography. You can see that right here. If you take a look here, you can see these bishops who are supposed to be priests. These look nothing like priests do in the ancient world, and certainly not amongst the Hebrews. The coronation actually is more about medieval thought than really what happens in the days of Solomon, because the coronation shows all three elements necessary for a king to have divine blessing. The first of these is, in fact, the blessing of inheritance, the blessing of David, that David's blood runs through your veins. Now, at this point, you really want to grab your handout, if you'd like, that's got the descendants of Queen Elizabeth II, because we're going to talk about this looking at these descendants. Because the whole point is who gets the throne. Now, there are really four methods of inheritance. This is not something Hincmar discusses because it's well known in his day. The first of these is kind of fraternal inheritance. Fraternal inheritance means it's going through brothers before it goes through sons. That's usually an indication that something's very, very wrong. We see this in ancient Macedonia. We see this actually in the 800s in England when the Vikings are inheriting, and you just can't have an infant on the throne. You can't have a small child, even if he's got a better claim to the throne. You've got to go through the adults first. And we also see this very typical of China, even though it's not necessarily unstable, but we see them doing this. The others are, we can see easily if we look at the kind of line of descent from Queen Elizabeth. Now, the first of these after fraternal inheritance is heirs male only. And if we want heirs male only, none of these people can be in the line of succession, because they're all coming, and that includes Philip up there. And by the way, everybody in purple is the direct line of ascent. Everybody with a yellow ring is actually blood royal and is actually eligible to take the throne. Spouses are not. Now, you'll notice that the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, is actually in yellow because he's like fifth cousins to the Queen. I'd have to go track it down, and I didn't right before class. And but all of them are descendants of Queen Victoria. So if Victoria is not eligible, none of these people are. The French actually use this. Japan currently does. That no inheritors, no one from a female in the royal line can actually inherit, even if there are male descendants in that line. The French will fudge it occasionally if they have to, but they don't really want to. And they'll pull out Salic law when they really don't want to. But the Japanese do not go through the female line anymore. They did in the 800s and the 900s, but they don't any longer. What you'll see in England and in most of Europe is, and except for the Habsburgs, who really don't, no, the Habsburgs will go through the female line. What you see is a heirs male first, which is what we see here. In other words, the boys get it before the girls. Now, Queen Elizabeth II is one of only two daughters of George VI. Therefore, she gets the throne first. With her own children, it's really kind of an easy thing to see. You see Charles, Anne, Andrew, and Edward. Well, Charles is the heir apparent, and he is, in fact, first in line. Okay. But it's easy to see with his younger siblings, because Anne and her descendants, if you're going by strict birth order, which is what we call heirs general, then Anne is, and her descendants should come right after Harry and his children. But it doesn't go that way. Instead, it goes Charles, his heirs, then Andrew, his heirs, then Edward, then to Edward's son, the Viscount Severin, then to Lady Louisa, then to Anne and the descendants of her son, Peter Phillips, and then back to Zara and her daughters Mia, Grace, and Lena Elizabeth. But here, and for centuries, that's been it. Heirs male first in England. 2013, which required the consent of 16 parliaments, the succession to the throne was actually changed. And by 16 parliaments, I mean 16 parliaments of 16 separate countries. Okay, the parliaments of 16 countries. To approve a change to the succession of the crown, according to a 1931 law, requires the consent of all the parliaments for which the queen is the head of state. And so now it goes Charles, William, George, and Charlotte, and then Louis. Louis does not skip his older sister like happened with Anne, because they've changed it to heirs general, which is strict birth order. And then after Louis, it goes back up to Prince Harry and then to his son Archie. And I think I've belabored that probably long enough. Now, and it needs to advance now. Okay, why is it not advancing? There it goes. You see these 4 methods of inheritance, and there are other ways to become king through election and through conquest, obviously. But the blessing of David is one key piece in the coronation of Solomon. The other piece is Zadok the priest, who is God's presence there, not just through the blessing he gave David, but now through the blessing of the priest himself. And for the medieval audience, that's the church. That's the priests who, once again, are administering the sacraments of the coronation. But there's also another figure at the coronation of Solomon, and that's Nathan the prophet. You remember Nathan, who rebukes David for taking Bathsheba by the parable about the lamb. Well, Nathan the prophet is God through the people, the citizens, the nobility, at least initially, who are also at, in fact, the coronation. Those soldiers, those nobility, are in fact key in making certain that God's blessing is given. And the way it works is that a Christian king has responsibilities, as we've talked about in Psalm 72 and Deuteronomy 17. He's got to seek justice, mercy, protect the oppressed. It's really Micah 6:8 written large for the entire community. That's what he's responsible for. And the coronation oath, which for Britain was written in 973 by St. Dunstan, using the coronation psalm of Psalm 72, is what, in fact, is still pretty much the coronation oath. The current coronation oath actually dates to Edward the Confessor in the 11th century. The coronation oath seals the covenant, and if, in fact, the king does not abide by this, then it's the responsibility of the church and the people eventually to tell the king, no, you can't do this. You're not acting as a righteous, godly monarch. Now, there are going to be a number of other authors who write on monarchical authority in the Middle Ages. John of Salisbury, who is going to serve as the private secretary to the Pope for a while in the 1100s. In about the 1140s, he does that. And so he's going to have a lot of different roles. He's also going to serve as the justicar, or the administrator of justice in England for a time. So he's going to be a busy guy in several different places. And so he's got a really good sense of what monarchy means. And so in his work Polycratus, which is dated to about 1159, he talks about the difference between a prince and a tyrant, and that the authority of a prince depends on justice and law, and that a tyrant does not have authority. Because he's not using justice and law. He's going back to Augustine, the idea that this is just a brigand, that a tyrant lacks authority from God because he's not abiding by God's laws. The prince is the servant of the law. And he discusses Deuteronomy 17 and makes the point that a king is also subject to the law, that he's not the law, he is subject to it. Now, this is going to be a matter of some debate when we get to King John in England and certainly Louis XIV in France. That's a very key piece, though, of what he's going to talk about. Thomas Aquinas is going to follow this up. Aquinas writes on a lot of things, and we're most familiar usually with the Summa Theologica, the sum of all theology. But he writes a specific work on kingship in 1267, and he's writing to the king of Cyprus at this point. And he's going to actually pull, once again, some from Aristotle. We're going to hear some echoes of Augustine, certainly here. He sees the state as a natural moral community and as a moral good, not the necessary evil that Augustine does. Aquinas and Augustine do not always agree, and Aquinas sees the state as a natural moral community. He sees the key to this moral community is citizen participation. Now, he does not mean voting. He means citizens participating in the community to bring it good things. And he sees that as something that's advocating for public good. Hello, dear. And for justice. He sees monarchy as the best, with some aspects of kind of a mixed constitution that you see from, in fact, Aristotle. The idea of the nobility having some representation, that you have a bit of a community, that an aristocracy here, but he doesn't necessarily want to advocate for a republic per se. There's Aquinas. He sees nature and the spirit are very fused. He is not going to see a lot of difference between the law of nature and the law of the spirit. Natural law was for him the extension of spiritual principles, because Aquinas believes in one piece of scholasticism that's going on in the Middle Ages. For him, means that there are two types of truth, one that's observed truth and one that's revealed truth. And he doesn't see them as contradictory. If there ever is a clash, obviously revealed truth supersedes and is superior to observed truth, because that just means that we're making the wrong observations. He doesn't actually see them as conflict. He sees them as lines that are coming from the same source, God. Okay. And natural law, therefore, which is observed, is simply an extension of the spiritual truth of revealed truth. He sees the use of reason as directly linking one with God. So he has no problems with Cicero or Aristotle. Now, the Holy Roman Empire also has a role in this, because the Holy Roman Empire, which originates with Charlemagne, or at least the term is first used in, is going to both be hereditary and have elected kingship. The kingship goes through Charlemagne's heirs, and then it shifts to another line. Hold on one second. The early use of this, like I say, begins with Charlemagne, but it is going to be an elected kingship. Eventually, you're going to get, about 1356, you're going to get a narrowing of those who get to actually elect the Holy Roman Emperor. But before that, you get all kinds of people voting on who's going to be Holy Roman Emperor. Almost always it's from certain families, but you're going to get Richard the Lionheart, Richard I of England, voting on who gets to be Holy Roman Emperor. Because the Holy Roman Emperor was not just one more regular ruler. He was different. And that's going to be part of what Dante talks about in De Marcaria. He probably wrote this between 1312 and 1313. Now, Dante is a great writer in the Divine Comedy. His work on monarchy, he writes in Latin, and quite frankly, it's not nearly as brilliant as Dante. Sorry for the interruptions. Apparently, our air conditioner has stopped working and the repair guy is coming. So here is the crazy of what's going on right now. Dante is not as brilliant in his work on monarchy, but he does kind of explain the theory of the Holy Roman Empire. The concept of the Holy Roman Empire was, in fact, that the empire was supposed to be this overarching emperor over all of the other little kingdoms of Europe, and to be able to go toe-to-toe with the papacy, which of course is what's going on in Dante's own day. Is the emperor is arguing with the pope, The King of France is arguing with the Pope, and we have, once again, one of the multiple battles of this 1,000-year argument. But that this is an elected monarch. He still has the same set level of authority that any other king has. And actually, because he's being elected by other rulers, he is superior to them. And he also argues that monarchy is necessary for man, that this is key to our nature. Dante is going to believe much more in the idea of a fallen will. He's a lot more in agreement with Augustine than he is in Aquinas. But then again, Aquinas lives in a period in the 1200s when things are going fairly well. And so there's not nearly as many arguments at that period. He sees the necessity of man's government to emulate God's government. In other words, the idea that God has to be a monarch, therefore a king is necessary. Now, eventually in the Summa Theologica, his Sum of All Theology, he's going to actually go into some greater detail in some things. This is his masterwork. It's the Sum of All Theology and the Sum of All Knowledge. But in the Summa Theologica, when he talks about monarchy and when he talks about governance, he's actually going to be closer to Augustine, not to, closer to Aristotle than he is to Augustine, because once again, he's going back to the state as a natural entity. And that's what we see in his other work on kingship directly. Politics is natural, but it's also part of one's spiritual welfare. Reason is the defining characteristic of mankind. Aquinas is much more positive about man and the nature of man. He's actually going to be more like Locke and Cicero than he is about Augustine. Augustine is not very positive about man. But then again, Augustine lives in a place, in an era with invasion and disruption, and that's going to shape part of his theology in a lot of ways. So this idea that reason is what separates man from the animals is very much going to be what Aquinas believes. He sees reason as aiding us in directing our lives toward God and away from sin. Aquinas is not an emotion dude. He's a mind guy. He's going to believe very much in the power of reason over the power of the emotions, and that reason directs us to God. Aquinas is actually going to be one of those who coins one of the great arguments for God, the teleological argument. Now, he thinks this is a supportive faith, not an argument that is going to necessarily lead you to faith. He's going to apply Aristotle to political life because he's already said that reason is critical for understanding God. Now, unfortunately, Aquinas is going to have very similar ideas about women to Aristotle too, as well. So that's a whole other issue. Although I take that back. He's actually more favorable to women than Aristotle. But we're not always going to agree with him. But he does actually see a separation between the church and the state. And he's not leaving Augustine behind entirely, because he sees the church as a supernatural good, not a natural one. In other words, that business of revealed truth versus observed truth. The state is a natural good, an observed good, whereas the church is a supernatural, a revealed truth. So it's actually superior, okay? The political state was merely earthly, so the church was superior. The secular and the sacred had separate but both sanctioned fields, okay? Reason was sanctioned by the divine, therefore it sanctioned the state. But revelation, once again, that two-pronged thing is always the measuring stick, because if this is telling you one thing, this cannot contradict it. If you think it does, then your thinking is in error. Okay. Christianity plus Aristotelian naturalism is what we call Thomism or Thomism, which is meaning Thomas Aquinas. The prince must behave rationally because rationality is going to lead to righteousness, because he has to make decisions for the entire community. And the ideal church and state relationship for Aquinas is in fact going to be one in which you've got a rational state and the king is ensuring righteousness and justice and mercy. That makes an agreement with Hincmar. The church holds the king accountable and calls the king to righteousness, and if he isn't going to be reasonable and righteous, then the church can step in. Did it work? Here's where the practical meets the theoretical. Sometimes yes, sometimes no in this 1,000-year argument. When it doesn't work is the question of investiture. Investiture was the appointing of a bishop or investing him in his office. And in doing that, the church is going to claim that they're the ones who ought to do this. But that doesn't always work. But the problem with, oh yes, the Pope should be the one who appoints the churchmen, is often these churchmen also had secular authority. So these separate sanctioned fields weren't always that separate in real life. And that's when you get into conflict. The investiture controversy's height is between 1075 and 1122. But there are lots of different kind of clashes between where the church's authority is and where the state's authority is. And in this case, it's between Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII. Gregory's going to claim that only the Pope can appoint bishops. Henry's going to say, oh, no, you can't. And by the way, I can not only appoint my own bishops, I can preach and do miracles without the authority of the church. They get into quite a heated battle, a battle that actually ends in Henry sending knights to beat up the Pope. The Pope is actually going to excommunicate Henry before he actually sends knights. Pope's going to excommunicate Henry. Henry's going to have to do penance for 3 days in the snow. And the Pope really doesn't want to forgive Henry, but he has to. Why? Well, because he did penance. Therefore, and he's asked for forgiveness. Therefore, I have to forgive him, even if I don't think he's repentant. He wasn't. And the Pope is going to excommunicate him again. Henry's going to try and form his own church with himself as the head and send knights to beat up the Pope. The Pope never forgives him, and Henry's going to actually die in an excommunicated state. And it's not going to be until after both of these principals are dead, you'll notice the 1122 date, before they actually come to some sort of agreement about where the king's authority stops and where the church's begins. Now, it's not usually this much of a giant argument, although you get other instances, Henry II and Thomas of Becket. You're going to get other instances between the kings of France and the papacy. You're going to get a lot of these where it doesn't work. But there are instances where it does. And the one where it does is actually going to be with King John. John is not going to be a good king. He's going to go into conflict with both the church and the nobles. And his conflict with the church and the nobles is going to lead him into all kinds of trouble. And leading the spearheaded charge against him is going to be, well, Archbishop Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Hi, guys. Sorry, I had to leave for just a few minutes. As I said, they're looking at the air conditioning, and I don't want to stop recording. We got too far into it. One of the things we see with John, we hear John, and you probably remember John from watching Robin Hood at the very least, that John is, and in Robin Hood, he's Prince John. That's before he becomes king, when Richard the Lionheart, his elder brother, dies. John is going to be very much believing in his own authority. Shakespeare, when he writes a play about King John in the 1600s, actually in about 1598, he's going to say that he's going to put some words in John's mouth and also in Richard II's mouth when he writes the play Richard II, that the law is in my mouth, that concept, that from Shakespeare. The law is in my mouth. This is something we see from John, that he's very much going to rule by his own whim. And that's the very kind of unreasonable rule that, well, quite frankly, uh, none of them are going to be comfortable with. That's the kind of thing that is unjust, and that's going to be brigandry as far as Augustine's concerned. It's going to be a lack of reason on the part from the perspective of Aquinas. From the perspective of the guys in England, it's just a problem. And it leads him into conflict with both the church and the aristocracy, with his nobles. Now, remember, let's go back to Hincmar for a minute. The church and the nobles are two of this three-pronged blessing that the king rules by, okay? And if we go back to our mandate of heaven, something's going wrong, and we aren't going to discuss that part. We're not going to discuss the mandate of heaven too much today. That there are signals that things have gone wrong. And if the mandate is being removed, well, here it's not about mandate, it's about the blessing of God. And if you're having arguments with both church and your nobles, then something's going wrong. And what they're going to tell John is the blessing of your inheritance is not sufficient to rule, which is the message that you get in Hincmar. It's the message that you get in John of Salisbury. It's the message that you get in Dante. It's the message that you get in Aquinas. It's not enough. It's also the same message you get from Augustine. So while they have their differences, this piece they agree on. Okay? Inheritance isn't enough. And one of the signals of the problems is that leading the charge against John is going to be Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton. Archbishop Stephen Langton is representing Zedek in Hincmar's model. He is going to begin preaching straight out of, Deuteronomy 17 to rebuke John. And he begins rebuking John by about 1204. 1202 even. He's beginning to preach sermons telling John, you can't do it this way. You've got to change how you're doing this. And so that's a pretty early sort of things. By 1203, you have a list of demands from the nobility about what John is doing wrong. And his losses on the battlefield, quite frankly, that begin in about 1204, ironically, right, or perhaps fittingly, right when his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, dies, are going to compound things, because that means that maybe you don't have the blessing of God if you're losing on the battlefield to the French. But at the Great Council of 1203 is these nobles saying, you can't do this. So here we have Nathan and Zedek, both of them objecting to what John is doing. And eventually it culminates in the document that I gave you a copy of, in case you don't have one handy, of Magna Carta. Magna Carta occurs at the field of Runnymede on the 15th of June and 1215. It's right outside of Windsor Castle. It's right there. There's the field, and this portico that you see here is actually built by the American Bar Association in the field of Runnymede to kind of honor what the legacy of Magna Carta for the United States. And I gave you also a handout that's about the parallels between the Magna Carta and the Constitution that you can see here, despite, medieval language. But what they're saying here at Runnymede is that both king and the king is ruling not just by the blessing of inheritance, but by the blessing of all three of these pieces: church, nobility, and inheritance. All of these are places where God's blessing is showing through. And what you get here is the opening, and I encourage you to please go read the opening of the Magna Carta, because the Magna Carta is actually going to begin with this statement from Archbishop Stephen Langton saying, look, you can't disturb the peace of the church. And this is what you have done. John's not been appointing bishops. He's just leaving them open so that he can collect revenues. He is mistreating the nobles. He's violating the rights of the city of London. There's a host of things that are being listed here that he's done over and over and over again. Now, John actually has also gotten already into trouble with the Pope. He's actually been put under what we call interdict, which is excommunication plus. Excommunication plus, I've absolved all the nobles in your land of, in fact, their loyalty oaths to the king. John gets put under interdict twice. And after the last one, he has to go and do kind of feudal homage to the Pope, and he offers up England as a fief to the Pope, which the Pope accepts. And John's actually going to try and get out of Magna Carta by appealing to the Pope to declare it null and void, his agreement to this. Well, then the nobles really do revolt, with Archbishop Stephen Langton are disagreeing with Pope Innocent and supporting the ability. They actually ask a Frenchman to come over and be king. We're going to reject you. Now, why don't we get a new king? Well, because John dies in 1216 of eating too many peaches. It's actually diarrhea complicated by too many peaches, and it's dysentery that kills him. He dies of dehydration, which is a really nasty way to go. And his son becomes king. And the nobles are actually going to regain some control. And we're going to see William Marshall, who comes in as regent, who's going to be a very just man. In other words, Magna Carta is the moment for a host of reasons. It's saying, no, the king is not above the law. Okay, it's the same moment that you get with U.S. versus Richard Nixon. No, you can't do these things. And we continually argue with our leaders to say, no, you're not above the law. That's when we get the most angry with them, no matter who's in office, because we're like, no, we did this. We did this already. And we did this in 1215. The Reformation, though, is going to change a lot of the relationship. Catholic rulers are going to make the church subordinate to the state. France will remain largely Catholic, but Henry VIII's contemporary, Francis I, is going to put limits on the authority of the Pope within France. Limits that Louis XIV, a century later, will only expand. State churches, which were the only acceptable church within the state, the Church of England being one, but that's also true of the countries that convert to Lutheranism. And we see it embodied in things like the Peace of Augsburg and the Treaty of Westphalia. But the trouble is that if you have a state church, then who can preach against the king? Because now who can call them back to righteousness or to reason, if you're Aquinas, when they depart from it? And this begins to make Nathan more important than Zadok, at least for a good long time. The rise of resistance theory. When can you resist a monarch? Is going to be part of what we see in the Reformation period. And that's going to be the rise of Nathan in politics. And we see a lot more creation of the theories of the state in late medieval politics and in the Renaissance, because it's actually beginning to change again. We see the Renaissance talking about the state, the courtier, the prince. All of those are going to feed into this new movement once the Reformation has irrevocably changed this kind of relationship between church and state. This is, with the Reformation, we really do see the end of this 1,000-year argument in some ways, but we still argue about what the relationship is between church and state. And I think this has a lot to tell us, because in our own day, when we talk about we the people, we're still talking about Hinkmar. We're still talking about our ability to be God's voice through the people, and the people as the prophets, to say no. Now, that doesn't mean that people always follow the will of God, but that's why when we talk about voting and things, that it's become so important to us, is because we feel like we are the ones giving sanction. God is giving sanction through us to those in power. It's still an important thing. There's also another piece that I'll mention right here on my final screen is that as state churches emerge, you start to see what we call the dissenters in England, those who aren't part of the state church, are going to have to be the ones who call the monarch to account, along with Nathan. So even though church and state are separate, what the Middle Ages is going to tell us in this 1,000-year argument is that the church does have a role in politics. It doesn't have a role to say who can be in government and who can't, but it does have the responsibility to speak truth to power, to call them to righteousness, to be the ones who are doing the calling out. And that's a key thing to keep about. And next time we'll talk a little bit about just war. So TTFN if you're Tigger, and if you're a Mickey fan, we'll see you real soon.